Network Automation Nerds podcast. Hello, welcome to Network Automation Nerds podcast, a podcast about network automation, network engineering, Python, and other technology topics. Today on the show, I am super excited to welcome my friend Ratul Mahajan to the show. Ratul is the CEO and co-founder of Intentionet and an associate professor at the University of Washington. He has helped develop several technology in the areas of software-defined networking, network verification, and debugging, including the open source tool Batfish. I am super excited to welcome Ratul to the show, and let's dive right in. Hey, Ratul, how are you? Thanks for taking the time and being here on the show.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while since we talked to each other, but I could see that you're still healthy. You're standing. You're still teaching at UW, so everything is good, I presume.
It has been a while. There was a time when we used to work at the same company. I remember that's where I met you first. But yes, I think a lot has happened in the interim, and somehow we've ended up in similar circles.
Yeah, yeah.
So
You
yeah.
you
So that's
you took a definitely took a path less traveled, right? I remember talking to you, and you're like, yeah, MS research is it's cushioning and it's very comfortable. I think you were there for many years, and
mhm.
but this is definitely more exciting for you. So we'll get into that for sure. So
All right.
I'm super glad
All right.
we get the chance to talk. So how about this? Let's, how can you just tell us who you are, a little bit about yourself, and how you got into the technology field? Like kind of your origin story.
Wow. That's a
You're
heavy
like,
question. Who am I?
how long do
Who
we
am
have?
I? It's a short story. I don't know. Who am I? I think I would say I think of myself mostly as a network engineer slash researcher by training. That's what and I love to build new tools, new network architectures, new large distributed systems, and teach about it. Do V zeros and things like that. I think that's what I kind of love to do. And just training wise, I think got a have a bachelor's in computer science, kind of PhD in computer science, and then was at Microsoft Research for a bit. Then doing this company, and now I straddle between Intentionet and University of Washington. Yeah. But if you're asking, how I kind of get into this, it's always kind of how I got into kind of technology or something. That's always like, hard to say. Things happen in life, right? But I would also say that I'm guessing by technology, you mean, information technology. I sometimes feel like, IT is so dominant that it's become synonymous with technology. But, there's a lot of technology out there, like, vaccines, is just as an example. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, we all play in a very narrow sliver. And I think mine maybe, if I were to pick like a specific event or something, maybe an origin story not too different from, other curious kids. I believe like, in early high school or something, I started pestering my parents for like whatever the latest video game console was, and I didn't get it. And I think instead what they got me was like a PC. Okay, if you want to play games, you write your own games kind of thing. And I wrote some really shitty. I wrote some really shitty games in Basic and CorelDRAW that were no fun to play. But anyway, I think what that did was kind of got me into programming. And then I think I was kind of lucky enough to get into a great kind of CS bachelor's college back home in Delhi, in India, and kind of like the rest is somewhat history. I think the initial curiosity and the interest brought me here. I think from there, I would say like just as the technical journey goes, it's been a linear path. One thing led to another, and then another, and then another. Yeah.
Nice. Do you remember the first model that your parents got you?
I do not remember. I was trying to think about it some time ago. I think it may have been like the Pentium had just come out, or maybe the thing right before Pentium. I don't know if you remember. I think Intel, in early '90s, Intel went on a tier, starting with like I think the generation of the processor before Pentium or something along those lines. But this was also
Yeah.
the time, at least in Delhi, like you never bought, you always bought like assembled computers, right? Like
Right.
there was like, no, you can't just order from Dell or Compaq like a nice machine. But instead, what you did was you bought a motherboard, you
Yeah.
got You got a CPU, you got some memory, and then you got some local guy to put it together, or you put it together yourself. And that was also kind of great experience to see the events. I think computers nowadays, my MacBook, if I open it, I don't even know how to open it up. And I'm sure as soon as I open it up, it's dead. But computers were different back then. Like I remember, you increase or decrease your memory, you do whatever you want. If the video card's busted, you just do your own, service your own things, and which was both kind of fun, but and as well as kind of learn a lot around how things work. Uh,
Yeah, totally. I do remember pre Pentium. I remember it was like a big marketing push when they did like the
yeah,
Pentium Insight for the
right,
Intel, like
right,
I guess the Wintel,
yeah,
right?
right, yeah, yeah. That's right. The Intel Inside. So everybody wanted like why do you care about the CPU? I think back then people cared about it. Intel.
Exactly.
Intel made people believe that they should care about the CPU in their computer. Let's just
Exactly.
say that.
And how arrogant was that, right? Like you're just like, I don't even care if you like Intel or not. As long as you buy a PC, then I'm happy, right? Like as long as you buy, as long as you have, they're so
Right.
dominant that as long as you buy a CPU of any kind, they'll benefit from it.
Mhm. Yeah, in the end, I think we all kind of experience, computing through the applications we use. I mean, that's
Yeah.
where maybe the genius of marketing was. Like, what really matters is how well Photoshop or Word is working. What doesn't really matter is like whether it's running on Intel or AMD. But I mean, of course, it matters. But it is like maybe two layers removed from what a user may actually care about. But yeah, I think those were the heydays. Early 2000s, late 90s. Intel Inside.
Yeah, 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 for sure. I still remember that jingle, and I don't know if you ever had those the Nux, like the Intel Nux, but I used it like I think the first version, they even have that jingle along with the box. So you open out the box, and then you will actually play the dun 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 like that that little jingle, and I was like, oh my god, that brought back memories. So that was pretty genius of them. But of course now it's like I guess ARM is the new hot thing, and everybody's trying to do the low power
um,
CPU and all that.
yeah, yeah. ARM is the hot thing, and but AMD is still around, and but comes of course comes and goes, and what Intel's been doing, it's kind of interesting as well. It seems like a lot of their focus is on networking and connectedness, and not just CPUs. At least just judging from the outside, the kinds of moves Intel's been making.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think in terms of just hardware and ecosystem, it's just amazing. I think the era we are kind of living in. I think it's not just kind of Intel, but Nvidia making waves as well in networking, and kind of almost like challenger from left field. And, and Broadcom, of course, keeps getting bigger. So I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's like it's amazing to see how I don't even know if what term we should call it, right? Like smart NIC or DPUs or
Mhm, mhm.
whatever it is that they call it, but
Yeah.
basically smart NIC. I would just treat them as smart NICs, and like programmable that goes out so deep into the hardware.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but I want to get back to what you were saying. So
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
finished, you're studying, you came to the US for schooling and
Yeah.
eventually got your
Yeah.
PhD. And then what
Hmm.
happened? Because you kind of brushed through that, but there's just so much
Uh,
there. So
yeah, so I think if you wanna, I think what is the path like? So maybe if you wanna dig into that a little bit. So after I got into computer science program at IIT Delhi, and you really have to be kind of work hard and be lucky enough to get in, but I kind of got there, and I think what I kind of discovered there was that I was kind of more drawn towards more systems oriented things like networking, operating systems, compilers, and building real stuff. I mean, theory and algorithms and everything else was fun. The information retrieval, data management was also fun, but I just love the idea of building and helping build kind of working systems. And I could
right,
have honestly like picked any of those things, and I wasn't like particularly cared. Except I think there was a lots and lots of fun stuff going on in networking. So I think we are talking basically late 90s here, and late 90s in Delhi. And I think right when I entered college, I think we used to get like internet network connectivity 2 hours a day when there was a satellite right above Delhi. between
Oh
2
my
a.m.
god.
and it's between
When the
between
stars
2
aligns.
it's basically that. Like now we have geostationary satellites in LEO, but back in the day there weren't that many satellites in there. There was one satellite called VSAT. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, it would basically be there'd be connectivity, and we used to do like on like a text-based search. So send your query at 3 a.m. today, and then tomorrow you'll get your answer or something. The internet was very text-oriented. We can't just hard to
Yeah.
imagine. But it's not just that. It was transitioning from there to dial-up came. Then
Yep.
more excitingly, kind of waveland came right around there, like which is so waveland. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a precursor to Wi-Fi. This little card you could plug into your kind of PCI slot on the outside, and it'll give you a shocking speed of 1.2 megabits per second or something like that. And
Nice.
so this was that was going on at the same time. I think people who were at IIT Delhi, they were laying out the first version of basically backbone that was connecting like all the major research universities in India, kind of like Internet 2 of, so it was called ERNET, I believe, Education and Research Network. So
Hmm.
almost like all said and done, I think for a curious kid kind of interested in networking, there was just lots and lots going on compared to operating systems that at that point were not that interesting. Maybe now, of course, they are. I think the whole computing, I believe, like we're living in a golden age with respect to how computing is changing. But anyway, all the networking activity kind of got me into networking, and then that led to coming to UW to get a PhD in networking. Did a lot of stuff around routing, understanding the structure of the internet, and so forth. And after kind of graduated, I think Microsoft research kind of felt like a very natural place at the time. Natural in the sense that I love being a grad student, doing research, building real things, to the extent that researchers build real things. Of course, engineers do a lot more, almost 100x more than what researchers do, but that's on me. And that was a natural extension because it was a place where I could go build research prototypes and new types of things. And it was kind of almost like an extension of grad school.
Right.
But yeah, and that was a lot of fun. And there was also kind of, I think I got really lucky in that sense. Like when I joined Microsoft Research, that was in 2005. Microsoft had very limited as a company had very limited interest in networking.
Yeah.
That there was Windows and there was the host TCP stack. That's what their interest in networking was. Of course, it was one of the companies that saw Wi-Fi relatively early, and but all of the interest was limited so much in the host stack itself. However, I think a couple of years after I started, I think 2007 when AWS or something like that came up, and that completely changed. People like me who do research in networking and distributed systems, suddenly that whole area became front and center for the company. And
Right.
for people who are looking to joining research labs or industrial research labs, I kind of realize it now after the most fun place you can be is where the company's kind of technical focus aligns with what you want to do. And it's a completely different thing. So what I mean is like, as a networking and distributed systems researcher, they were like, $100 million problem or $1 billion problem kind of everywhere almost, right? Because
Yeah.
and so I could almost kind of pick and choose problems that were technically interesting, research wise interesting, and yet could have like a big impact on the company's kind of business as well. So that was a very, very fun ride, and developed a whole bunch of stuff that with a lot of kind of engineering as well, kind of went into kind of Azure and other stuff, and that was one of the most kind of gratifying things to see technical ideas over time coming to fruition there. So
Yeah,
so I think like
definitely. Oh no, I was gonna say, I think you mentioned an interesting time when you mentioned 2005. I think you're absolutely right. I think 2006 is when like S3 came out, and 2007 was EC2 came out,
mhm, mhm,
and
right.
of course those just kind of open up the it just kind of bang the door wide open, right? And then you just kind of see this hockey stick growth. And I think when you mention Microsoft Research, because Microsoft Research was always like kind of the
Mhm,
front arm of pioneering into newer
mhm,
areas. And back
mhm,
then there was no Azure. It was like maybe like a
mhm.
research project. So Microsoft
Yeah.
Research was really at the front and center of trying to explore and see how they
Mhm,
could position Microsoft into kind of the next wave. So you're absolutely right. I remember that time period, and it was very exciting. And I mean, it's more exciting now, but it was very exciting back then for sure.
Yeah, I think. but the transition point in the sense of like, what technical problems like the business wants to solve, and when that aligns with what technical and research interests you have, I think that
Mm,
that alignment kind of shifted a few years after I kind of started there, and I could totally see like how my research was different and what I did was different, and I kind of looked at the world different, and that so that was there. I think you were of course there, and you could probably see like helping the network grow, and like from it was a different ball game from running MSN. I mean, it's not like Microsoft did not have data centers and properties, but there was yes MSN and so, but the scale of Azure,
yeah,
it's like the next year it'll be double than all the history of MSN combined, and the next year again you double. And that's just
yeah.
that type of hockey stick, like you mentioned. It's that was a fun place to be in.
Yeah, and I also think, yeah, so if you're talking about like there was obviously no Office 365 and they were selling Windows off like a DVD and
Right.
multiple of discs. So but what I believe really got the ball rolling was Bing, like MSN online services or like this
Hmm.
OSD group. But Bing was really kind of
Hmm.
where they
Hmm.
started to have these kind of
Hmm.
competing with Google with big data
Yeah,
centers, and
yeah,
now with
yeah,
big data center
right,
you have to have
yeah.
networking.
Hmm. Yeah, and all of that, I think my understanding is a lot of what Microsoft learned through Bing, running that kind of first party large scale application. Of course, a lot of that learning and people, which is where the best way to kind of transfer knowledge,
Right.
kind of joined Azure and made that happen as a more general purpose infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So during that time frame, I mean, you were have many different research projects, but one of them was Batfish, right? So can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
Yeah, so how do I kind of retrospectively, I would say this, like, in terms of how Batfish came about, I think I would say it really came together like a lot of things when two things that originally seem unrelated merge. So I think Batfish was also in that sense like a confluence of two things.
Okay.
One I would say was a solution or an approach that didn't quite work for the original problem. I'll tell you what that means. And the other was a problem that didn't have a solution.
Okay.
Okay, so the problem that didn't have a good solution was that we talked about like scaling the network and so forth, right? And the core challenge, of course, is like how do you do it safely? Like how do you automate safely? And and Azure folks who were scaling the network were kind of facing that, and we were of course like automating things heavily, and as what we kind of learned was that as we did that, while we were lowering the risk of some types of changes, we were actually worsening the risk of some other types of changes. Automation can do a lot of damage in a second, even if it does
Yeah.
not do damage frequently. And this is the like humans do small amounts of damage all the time, and automation does large amounts of damage some of the time. Like last week's Cloudflare outage, right? Like to take down 19 data centers in 5 minutes, it's not something you can humanly do, but
Right.
automation can do that. So I think some of us kind of are working. So that was a problem. So the thing is like, what can we do to solve that problem? And that problem
Hmm.
didn't have a good solution then. The solution that was in search of a problem was essentially, I had started with my kind of co-founder, Todd. We just kind of met at a conference. We said, wouldn't it be fun to apply more verification and formal methods techniques to the world of networking? So that'd be fun. And, took me back to, in, like we were talking earlier about college, I always loved compilers and things like that and formal methods as applied to systems. So this seemed like an opportunity to go investigate the curiosity I had, but never had time to seriously delve into it. This seems like a win-win and an opportunity to work with Todd as well, who I knew from grad school, but he was a professor at UCLA when I met him. I started working on this. I think that with that general idea, the first domain we explored was to actually properly kind of analyze whether network protocol implementations are compliant, whatever the definition means, compliant to an RFC or something like that. But we couldn't
Mm.
really, in all honesty, we couldn't really make it work in there. So this is what I mean. Like, so we had a solution approach in mind that didn't quite work, and then I think somehow naturally maybe realize that maybe we should take this problem that doesn't have an answer and take this answer that does not really answer the work in the vision thing, and let's try something out here. So that's how kind of Batfish came about. Todd had a student who had just started, Ari Fogel, like now kind of the original developer of Batfish. He had a little bit of networking experience as well, and understood, formal methods a little bit. And he basically took the problem and kind of ran with it. And kind of soon enough, I think, by soon enough, I mean, these types of things takes time, but within, a year or something, we were doing kind of analysis of UCLA network and Microsoft network and seeing really interesting results. And I believe that's where our paths crossed. I was kind of pestering you and your team, I believe, to kind of make it, to not just let it be kind of like a one-off, and somehow integrate that in the tool chain. Of course, that was a naive thought. Now I understand the complexity a lot better of taking a new tool and integrating with the pipeline. But that's how kind of this happened. I think there's this idea that networking needs to get more rigorous, and application of techniques from this other domain is a promising thing. And Batfish was kind of like a foray into that after after this other problem we looked at that didn't go much, I would say, there. So I think then, Ari was a really good, engineer, really good researcher, and he ran with it and made it work. And since then, we've been kind of working on it and making it better.
Yeah, so I definitely remember that time frame, and it was I think it was a valid tool. And to be honest, I wasn't the decision maker, right? I was just one of the worker bees. And we I remember, going to MSR, being, really
Yeah.
impressed with all the research results. And I don't even remember. I think we may have gone to lunch together as well, and we're just talking
Hmm.
about it. It was definitely a good tool, and we try integrating it into the system, and it was definitely very interesting and very valid, as you have proven so far, right? So for people who are not familiar with it, and I certainly, haven't, I've been following it, but I certainly not as familiar as you are, of course. So can you tell us a little bit about what the kind of what problem is it trying to solve? You talked about
Yeah.
validation,
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
causing
Yeah.
errors.
Yeah. Yeah. The key problem is solving is the following. Kind of very simple. That
Yep.
you want to change the configuration of the network.
Hmm.
How do you know this configuration change will not bring the network down? So take, I don't know, for those of you who read the Cloudflare outage, this is a common problem that network engineers face day in and day out. It's like, which is why changing the network is a highly risky proposition,
Right.
because a single line of config change can bring everything down. So people, I feel like people underappreciate how complex networking is sometimes, and sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for other reasons. That there's no kind of blast radius analysis of even a single line of config. Like you update software, and yeah, you can update one server at a time, and that's fine.
Right.
But in networking, that doesn't quite work. I think the dependencies are way too complex. Right. So going back to that, so what Batfish's job is to make sure that give you some assurance that this config change you're making to the network is safe.
Hmm.
And the way it does that is by we take the config, understand it, and we understand how the network will behave. So this is a network validation that's different from, a lot of engineers have written their own scripts to make, hey, is the configuration syntax correct? Is it like a third party analysis? Or sorry, site standards are met or not? So that would be, you can think of as like is analysis of the text of the config. But Backfish does that for you, but it also does like analysis of behavior of the network that will emerge. What
Hmm.
prefixes will it allow or not allow as route maps, and how will packets flow or not flow? So it builds a behavioral model of the network, and which then lets you get some assurance that, hey, from a behavior perspective, this change is safe or not safe. Yeah. So that's basically just the idea. And for those of you, in the audience who do software engineering, right? Like software engineering has CI tests. So think of that, but for networking, where you're saying, okay, after I make this change, make sure all my services are working before continue to work in there. So we kind of made it very powerful. You can write kind of simple queries on what you expect network behavior to be like, feed in a config change, and Batfish will tell you yay or nay.
Yeah, definitely a hard problem as the network grows bigger and bigger. So of course, if you have like a 10 line access list, you
Yeah,
could kind of
yeah,
know, whether that, change your access list will work or not. But I remember we have been in environments where there's thousands of line in one echo, and
yeah,
that's in multiple locations. So first of all, how to keep it consistent,
right.
just because a lot of times the TCAMs wouldn't be allowed to jam in all those echoes, so you have to partition them. And once you partition them, all bets are gone, right? Like you're just asking for disasters. So
Mhm.
in this case, we need some sort of tool such as Batfish
Yeah.
to, when you
Mhm.
implement that, you may or may not break certain parts of it that you're not
Yeah.
even
Of course.
aware of, because then you're
Mhm.
you're offloading some of the management to each of the service owners. And
Mhm.
what did they do? They may or not be aware of the blast radius, as you mentioned. So Batfish
Mhm.
allows you to, that's just one instance of how Batfish could help.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think the other thing that I think folks who are experienced network engineers will get it. But I think one thing that I actually did not have too much of an appreciation for before kind of starting Intentionet is that
Yeah.
tools like Batfish are not just about reliability.
Right.
In the end, what they do is let you sit in a different point in reliability and agility space. You can be super reliable, just give up on agility. Just look at the change
Yeah, the
for one
business will
year,
not grow.
make it really, yeah, yeah, exactly. So, or you can be super agile and not be reliable.
Yeah.
What the value of good tools is, like, it offers a very different trade-off in that sense. Like, it lets you be agile while being reliable in there,
Yeah.
or it lets you be reliable because any good tool kind of changes that trade-off. With a given fixed set of tools, you are making some design choices or making some trade-offs, and I think completely change reviews, for instance. Suppose you have an organization that doesn't have change reviews at all. It's super fast, and they made some trade-off for reliability and agility, so they can move fast and go. The new network engineer you hired last week can push an ACL to production, and that's one reliability agility trade-off.
That's a
The other
scary
is
thought.
that right, yeah, exactly, and there are of course networks that run like that, right? And or the other one is you've got a change approval board that meet once a week. You've made a different choice in reliability agility trade-off.
Right.
The job of, I think, any tool in automation is to offer solutions that let you essentially, in some sense, cheat and let you have both, right? So if a tool can review the changes, it can be fast and it can also be more reliable than humans.
Oh, the dreaded cab review.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Oh my god, yeah, I remember those. So how I would have wished to have a tool and just say pointed to say, well, that tool validated it would be okay, and
Right. Yep.
like, please let me go execute that change at, I don't
Mhm.
know, like 3 p.m. Right.
Yes, yeah, so funnily enough, I think like where we've deployed Backfish our customers, I think of course like our customers who use Backfish or Backfish Enterprise are network engineers, and they are happier about the agility side of the house that now they can do the changes faster, and like the business is not breathing down their neck for like holding up stuff. And of
Right.
course like they've gone up reliability, I think, and of course it's their bosses and managers that care about reliability a little bit more because the dollar impact is there. But I think definitely, I think our users love us um, for the agility we bring to the table. That it's like I was making three changes a week, and now I'm making 30 type
Right.
of thing.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I think you mentioned, kind of interesting that you mentioned what you were, your different perspective, like when you were a researcher and something that you maybe underappreciate or maybe you understand more nowadays. So that must have been a big jump between having a research project and
Hmm.
starting, kind of commercialize it, founding a company based on it, and leaving a cushion job on at Microsoft
Hmm.
Research. I mean, for people who don't know, like once you're there and once you're established, it's very hard to do to begin with, and it's also become very comfortable and
Hmm. Hmm.
really prestigious in the industry. So,
Hmm.
can you tell us that kind of process, what you go through, and how do you commercialize a research project, essentially?
Yeah. So maybe a little bit of backstory, and you hinted that, like, I think Microsoft Research was great. I had a lot of fun and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
think, and part of the reason for me to leave was that I learned that, or I realized that I had gotten too comfortable. It was, and somehow that scared me. It's like, okay, and it's okay. So what I'm gonna do next? What I'm gonna do next? And amongst different ideas, I think doing a startup was kind of one of them, and Batfish just happened to be there a couple years ago. I think we had written a paper. The project
Yep.
was kind of open source. We were still working on it. So amongst the ideas that I thought about, I think Batfish just came out to be, again, kind of confluence of timing and everything else. That Batfish is there, and I'm kind of a little bit unsettled personally. It's time to do something new. And that's how we say, okay, let's make a run at it. It's an opportunity to have impact on a bigger canvas than leaving things only within Microsoft or only within the research world. But it's an opportunity to say, come and like change how networking's done and more broadly. How networking works more broadly. So I think I see that as opportunity both to kind of learn a new set of skills personally, but also to see, maybe have a small footprint on, how networking's done and make it more rigorous and make it stand on a stronger foundation. So that was kind of like the combination of that urge and the combination of that kind of personally unsettled is like how intentional kind of came about to
That,
be. And I was kind of lucky enough that the two main folks who worked with me were came along for the ride as well.
yeah. So who were those folks?
Yeah. So these were like Todd Milstein and Ari Foger, like kind of co-founders, and so those were the two other kind of key folks in the development of Batfish. And I was kind of lucky enough that when I asked, should we do this, and they said, yeah, let's do it. Okay,
Oh
let's do it.
wow,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That it must have been exciting. I mean, you're just the. That's kind of funny. You mentioned it's kind of two things met at once. It's
Mhm,
you're growing restless, and
mhm,
you have this project that was gaining momentum. I remember reading about the paper that you published, and I think
mhm,
you did a few presentation on it, maybe at
mhm,
Nanog and
mhm,
some other places. I remember
mhm,
watching
mhm,
them. Yeah,
mhm.
so definitely
Yeah.
cool. But it's still no small feat, right? So what are some of the challenges for you when even though you have two great co-founders and you have this project that is gaining momentum, but starting a
Yeah.
company is still kind of a challenge,
Um,
wasn't it?
yeah, absolutely. I think it's not easy, but if you just keep like a learning mindset and talk to people, I think most of us can do it. And just as a startup, we had a lot of usual challenges, like hiring is always a big one.
Yeah.
Raising money, finding customers, doing sales, and all of that is but maybe it's worth kind of talking about challenges that are unique to the domain we were in. So to keep this
Yeah.
conversation a bit technical.
Perfect.
So I would say like I would say like the unique challenge we had comes came from one way to say it, like it came from kind of my ignorance of the state of the networking ecosystem. Here's what I mean by that, right? Like so we talked about a bit of where I came from. I come from an academic research world, and the network operations that I had seen were Azure and things like that. So I think I was, so my understanding of network engineering at large was broken. It's a slightly less broken now, having worked with across a broad range of customers. So what I mean by that is kind of like the following. I think Backfish is a tool that does validation.
Yep.
The best way it can provide you a service is for you to have essentially for instance, a deployment pipeline that's automated. But as both you and I know, like most networks have kind of no such pipeline. I was just
Yeah.
wasn't aware of this fact. Coming from a hyperscaler world, I just thought this is how networking's done. But no, networking at large is not done that way, right? So this is what I mean by my mental model. So I think not knowing that, I would have positioned Batfish a little bit differently, kind of figure it out earlier. But it took us, 2.5 years to kind of figure that out. That the product as originally envisioned is not, there are kind of few buyers kind of for it. And of course, like the world has come along for sure a long ways, and all the work that you do, for instance, in educating the community and helping kind of upskill them or change their skills goes like a long way. So I'm kind of grateful for that. Any kind of education and evangelization that folks do, you included. Um, then so that was kind of one thing about like a mismatch between what was originally imagined and where the ecosystem was. The other was
Interesting.
kind of more again related to verification. I think one thing I hadn't realized, again coming from a kind of software engineering world or maybe more of an academic world, is like like verification as a validation mechanism is it takes a different mental model than what network engineers are used to. So here's what I mean
Hmm.
by that.
Hmm.
So let's say take a simple example. You're a network engineer and you want to make sure that the web server is accessible from behind the firewall, right? So what you'll do is you may run a trace route,
Hmm.
and from one of the hosts that you want to be able to access the web server, you run a trace route, and then if the trace route works, you go home happy. right? So that is great. That's great. But really, the beauty of verification is that, strong validation, or if you can say systematic testing, is that it can give you that guarantee for all possible hosts and for all possible source ports. So since there's a firewall involved, you don't know what's allowed and what's not allowed and so forth. So suddenly, the validation becomes not an exercise in confirming one positive test case like a trace route. It becomes an exercise in finding, is there any bad thing in this large set of possibilities? So as you can imagine, for simplicity, that's large as a policy source. So I think it's taken us a while to how to communicate that to network engineers, that the game here is making sure that nothing bad happens, as opposed to making sure that something good will happen. And these are fundamentally different things and fundamentally different technologies. So it's taken us some time to kind of, build it in a way that, we come closer to a network engineer's mental model and so forth. So I would say, in there. So I was just going to sum up, maybe, I think in terms simple analogy terms, like now I look at us like, we were building essentially, brakes and collision detection systems for electric cars when most of the folks did not have an electric car, and some were even driving horse-drawn buggies. So who's gonna buy those parts? So I think what we've done as a team at Intentionet then is, of course, help our users build electric cars, help our users, drive those cars, and at the same time adapt what our product does uh, to work, even if you have a horse-drawn buggy or you have a non-electric car. So we've done those things, so kind of so we can meet in the middle where the world is and where the product is, while not losing focus on where we ultimately want the world to be at. So that's been
Yeah,
a fun ride and learning, I think. Yeah. Right.
yeah, no, I totally appreciate the honesty, right? Like you were very straightforward and honest about the lessons you've learned. And we definitely network, I guess, automation and processing have come a long way, and we have the help of software developers to thank for
Mhm,
that. It's, there's already CI/CD pipelines, and there's already
mhm,
that they use in their world, like testing, for
mhm.
example.
Yeah.
And so you kind of
Mhm,
just borrow those parts and modify it enough to fit
mhm,
into network engineering.
mhm,
So can you tell us how, obviously you've gone through several iterations and pivots, but
mhm,
how is it usually typically Batfish being deployed in the network today? What's the most common use
mhm.
case? How they fit into the picture?
Yeah. So I'd say like the most common way to use, I would say like I'm somewhat closer to way Batfish Enterprise gets used, because we work with those customers kind of more kind of hand in hand. And of course, there's
Hmm.
a lot of large organizations running Batfish open source too. It's just that we know less because there's less
Yeah,
touch points there, right? And
yeah.
that's just the nature of open source things. But on the enterprise side of the house, I would say like a common modality, and this is where kind of meeting in the middle also works.
Hmm.
So for instance, I think we have this what we call like the change validation workflow. So you have a config change in mind. You can go to Batfish Enterprise portal. On that portal, you can specify the change you want to make, and this is exactly what you might be typing on the box. And we have a
Right.
little IDE that'll help you get the syntax right. That'll help you kind of cross-check references and so. So it's more powerful than typing directly in the box. But but more than that, then after that, you basically can create network policy that this is something that should happen in the network all the time, or this is something that should happen after I do the change. So think about like running your pre-checks and post-checks, and we have kind of high-level YAML-oriented ways to specify that, and then you hit a button, is my change safe? And
Hmm.
you essentially get like a full analysis that says, this was what's happening before the change, this is what's happening after the change, these of your tests are failing, these are passing. And by the way, there's also a full comparison of behavior differences, how your ribs and fibs in the network will change, which services will get impacted if you were to push this change out, and all that. So like a full report. The way we see it is like, this is basically all the math that Batfish is doing behind the head, your cab was doing in their heads. Like, what is the impact of this ACL change? With
Right.
Batfish, this is the impact. The answers are right there, and so that's one common kind of use case for some of our customers who, and all of this is API driven, of course.
Yeah.
So for some customers, what they are doing is they are taking classes of changes and taking human out of the loop in there. So think about like basically a fully automatic version of what I just described. that the change gets proposed via APIs, test and run. You get the change test reports automatically. Send it to Slack, send it to email. Doesn't matter. Build your workflows, and then decide whether or not you want to deploy. Or maybe some folks just deploy directly, or some people say, okay, now everything's done. Let me take a look at this difference in thing, and is this expected or not, and then go deploy. Yeah,
Nice. Yeah, so I forgot that person's name was the person in the Phoenix project. It might have been Brad or some version of the senior engineer. So you're it's almost like having a senior engineer's extra set of eyes and hands for you to
hmm
check. So you're taking that part out of somebody's human involvement, and then you evolve
yeah.
into a tool, so feed that into that human and kind of display that result to the people instead of just having that all done in his mind, his or her
That's
mind.
yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think oftentimes I do think of Batfish as like the most experienced network engineer
Hmm.
that there is, because it's been learning about that, and a network engineer that's also kind of familiar intimately with every single line of config, such that you would know that if a change in Chicago is bad because something else in Atlanta is not the way it should be, kind of thing, right?
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of networks today, for good or for bad, rely on that experienced engineer to know
Yeah.
who's day in the organization and know where the dead bodies are, knows where the snowflakes are. With Batfish, essentially, computers are good at doing that type of thing, and so reliance on that goes down, and Batfish basically becomes that kind of that expert engineer that is able to do like a full-on analysis of what looks like a small change, but may not be because of interactions we talked about earlier and there. And of course, like
Yeah.
our customers, like they based on the comfort level. After that, some things get automatically deployed if it's a standard change, and some changes still get looked at, and which is no different from how it happens with large changes in software, right? Despite all automation, there's still kind of manual testing. So I think the role of Batfish is, to help you move fast. It's not that I think we have not seen a customer where they've where the team size has been impacted or any such thing. It's just that they're just making 10x more changes, and that backlog is suddenly kind of going down. Given the tool help, things they were trying to do manually, they have to do less of, and as a result, have more confidence to push that deploy button uh, with joy, not with fear, so to speak.
Yeah, and that most senior engineer is expensive, right? You want him or her to
Yeah,
be doing the most profitable, which
on the
is
really, yeah, exactly. The most complex of changes and driving systematic architectural changes, not reviewing your, daily changes. That's exactly. So it lifts the level of abstraction that everybody at the team can operate at.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And then is there a feedback loop? Like, let's just say, it caught the error,
Mhm,
but
mhm,
maybe some human intervention was needed, in reviewing it, and they validate it and find out something that was missing in the original
mhm. Yeah.
validation. Is there a feedback mechanism for you to enter that into Batfish so that the next analysis would have caught this thing
Uh,
earlier?
Absolutely. So it depends on the exact workflow. So I'll give you an analogy from a real kind of customer case. So the
Sure.
change validation workflow I described, where you make the change, there's absolutely a feedback loop. Like, if a test fails, Batfish will help you understand why it failed.
Hmm.
Because some route map was broken, or some ACL was broken, or the policy was not as you expected it to be. And then you've done root cause analysis, and then right there you can essentially change the config. That, okay, I understand the problem, can I now change the config? And then all your test cases are set up, and then you say check it again
Yeah.
in there. So that's there, and this is kind of like the way you phrase the question. Like, a customer anecdote came to mind where I think they were changing, like, I believe they were changing the ISPs or changing MPLS to EPLS. I forget the exact change, and they thought
Hmm.
that what they needed was only for one router to change there.
Hmm.
And as they passed the change to Batfish, there were so many kind of hidden dependencies on that by trading on just Batfish alone and no deployment, they came to realize that 10 routers had to be touched for the change to go correctly through, and they were really kind of thankful that they could do all of that without actually touching the router. because
Yeah.
live debugging a network is really, really hard. So this is like to your point around iteration. That's where this anecdote kind of came to mind. That yeah, you can come back and just do a second pass, and your test cases are set up. No manual work needed. Um, Tests are there. Just change the config, change the change, and then check it again. It's one button. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just as valuable as having. I think that's even arguably more valuable than that senior, like the computerized senior engineer, right? Because
Mm,
now instead of just having that senior engineer
yeah.
tell you to do
Mhm.
A, B, and C, you
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
him
Yeah.
or her to explain it to you,
Right.
to see the
Yeah.
whys behind that. I mean,
Yeah.
when I was a junior engineer, I remember, kind of just following directions and not knowing the
Mhm.
why. But now with this
Oh
tool,
yeah.
you actually know the why as well.
That's true, and the feedback loop's a lot faster too, right? Like senior engineer
Yeah.
tells you, hey, this change looks unfair because of this reason. You go back and reason about it, and you come back the next day or the next week, depending on the exact process. Yeah. So this goes back to what we were talking about, where agility comes from in there. So how many maintenance windows does it take for you to push a change correctly through?
A lot
So,
cheaper. You don't have to buy that
yeah.
engineer lunch or coffee. It automatically tells you, because that used to be the relationship build I used to have, right? Like I would buy these
Oh yeah.
people, go to lunch with them just to
Oh, I see.
establish that
Review.
relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Review my change first, please. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
No, that's
Thank you,
true.
Brad, or
No,
whoever that may
that's
be.
cool. No, I think that's how software reviewing works today. Like with the PRs in our company, right? Like if a PR is
Yeah.
lagging, you want to make sure that you have on good terms on whoever's going to review the PR.
Yeah.
So,
To soften that
oh,
blow would
yeah,
be like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So
That's right. That's right. That's right.
you mentioned both the Batfish, which is the open source project, but also
Mm-hmm,
Intention Batfish Enterprise, which is the
hmm
commercial product that you guys support.
hmm
How do you
hmm
actually balance the two, right? Do you use the kind of the Red Hat Fedora model where you have something that's a little bit ahead of time, get it out there, get the community to test it first, and then make it
hmm
back into the more stable enterprise model? Or is this something else?
No, so our model is different.
Okay.
Our models, yeah, so our model is what's known as, I think, just colloquially like an open core model.
Okay.
So what that means is that we've got a core of our solution that is fully open source, and that's
Okay.
basically Backfish on GitHub public repo. And what that solution has parsing and modeling capabilities that are complete in there, and there's a query engine to it in there. So that's our kind of open core, full modeling, multi-vendor parsing, multi-vendor analysis, and query engine. The enterprise code wraps around this open code, and this enterprise by enterprise code I mean this is proprietary code where our focus has been on supporting teams of network engineers and helping folks get started easily and do kind of less maintenance. So to give you an example, like so earlier we talked about test cases and so forth, right? Batfish
Hmm.
enterprise test cases are declarative and written in YAML. Batfish open source test cases would be written in Python
Okay.
and so forth. So just to kind of like give you a difference, Batfish Enterprise comes with the UI. Batfish open source has kind of no graphical element to it. So the way we kind of saw that is that the goal of Batfish is fully complete for really advanced engineers who dabble in open source, can take it and run it, and that's how a lot of our users are running. But those who want a little bit more maintainability, a little bit more handholding, or just like an enterprise supporting their official deployment, that's where Batfish kind of enterprise comes in. That we have code that makes it both easy to use, easy to maintain, and run it across like a team of developers.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. So obviously, if you're listening to the podcast, we'll include the links in the show notes. But if you're watching the YouTube video, you could kind of see the difference between a open source version of, maybe a little bit less hand holding, but still very much thorough documentation on how to set it up, how to run it, as well as the Batfish Enterprise for getting started guide, and and obviously more engagement with the enterprise customers.
hmm Yeah, so if you're just looking to understand the difference, I think in the product page tab, there's a why Backfish Enterprise that explains the difference between just the open source. I think there's a third link on just that, like drop down.
Why Batfish Enterprise? Got it.
Yeah, so this basically captures what I just mentioned. Yeah, and by the way, I
Got it.
think we are happy to support like both types of I think for us. like I said, the mission is to change how networking is practiced, and both of these versions help that. Except one version works better for certain types of organizations, and the other version works better for certain other types of organizations.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's kind of interesting because I've always wondered about the sustainability, and I think that is a real issue, right? Like a lot of times,
Mhm.
open source project, even the most popular open source projects, relies really on just these core few folks dedicating their
Mhm.
time in their
Yeah.
garage and outside of work
Mhm.
to maintain it. Um,
Mhm.
so that's not very sustainable. So I've always wondered about popular open source projects. If we want to grow it, you can't just rely on donations. It has to be another model for the way to go.
Yeah, I think, and there's really no science to it yet. I would say, like, every business, I feel like, needs to kind of figure out what works for you. I think what works in software domain. I think one thing I would say, like in networking, um, is behind times when it comes to open source in a lot of ways, right? Like
Yeah,
today,
yeah,
you
for
you
sure.
cannot imagine a database technology without a very big open source component to it. You cannot imagine a whole lot of dev tools for softwares with the data without that around it there. But networking, I think the table stake expectations is not that there be open source backing, but I think that's changing. But the only thing I'd kind of add is that it is definitely something, and that has implications, by the way, as well. Like the network engineering community is probably a tenth of the size of the software engineering community,
Yeah.
or some such thing, and they're different. Their skills are different, so everybody needs to kind of figure that out. But I certainly hope that. Um, that more and more open source enters networking, and we figure out what models work for everybody in there, because I think open source users, not they also give back in other ways in terms of feedback and things like that, so that is definitely valuable, and it definitely also lowers the bar to usage, and I think there's 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 a net value that gets created, I do believe, from open source.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I wish there's more. I mean, people like yourself or Network to Code or Dinesh with Suzy Q definitely driving this movement forward on proving that open source could be a valuable tool. Like you said, the trust level was not as high, but
Mhm.
you could just look at the Linux world versus, I guess, our own
Yeah,
employer. That's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it's changing, and people should give this some thoughts on just having open source backend or supporting open source
yeah.
to so that it could grow.
Yeah. And not just that, I think this goes to, just what's a global good, right? And I think just like 2 days ago, for instance, it's easier when it's open source, like it's easier to build on each other's work. Like,
Yeah.
I think, for instance, I think Oracle released just recently a network verification tool built on top of Batfish.
Yep.
I think, and that was great. It's great for Batfish. It's great for, I think, community as well. But I think the fact that they could do that is because Batfish was kind of open source, and now they have a layered service on top. So, and to me that's gratifying, just because it's in line with what we wanted to see, which is more rigorous validation, more rigorous engineering of networks. So you kind of, as a technical community, I think being able to build on each other's work, you move a lot faster. And Oracle kind of did that. They just told us they were doing it, and they could just go do it. And
Oh,
and
wow.
and closed source world would have looked very, very different. They would have had to either redo what we've already done, or get stuck in months long of enterprise contracts to get a sign off.
Exactly.
But
I
look,
was gonna
this
say
this is great here. Yeah, right.
more lawyers will be involved.
Yeah,
Definitely.
exactly that. So yeah. So maybe one way to feel good about it, like what open source is, and taking money away from marketing people and legal people, and putting it right back into the engineering side. Maybe that's where the net
Engineers for the
good is
win.
coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, by the way, it's called the Oracle Cloud Network Path Analyzer, and as what Ratul was saying is just kind of integrating. I was surprised at how integrated it is to the product. So you don't need a separate installation. You don't need to ask a question or whatnot. These are all predetermined, and you just kind of plug it in. Of course, this is specific to Oracle Cloud, but hopefully, other cloud providers could follow suit and kind of do the same thing here, whether it's a homegrown tool or
Yeah.
like you said, just integrate an open source tool such as Batfish.
Mm, yeah. Just for kind of minor correction, I think AWS and GCP do have their verification tools.
Okay.
I think AWS is called Network Reachability Analyzer, and I believe Google's is called Network Intelligence Center.
Hmm.
And that's so the nice thing for me, like say like all these kind of validation or verification is becoming fast table stakes. So going from being used inside hyperscalers to large cloud providers making it accessible. It's good to see, and of course we kind of as Intentionet focused on that too, and focused on hybrid networks as well as data center networks. But it is one of those things that I hope in next 5-10 years becomes this is the way you run a network.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So, I mean, we're getting to the end of the
Mhm.
session. I feel you're really honest about your path. I do appreciate that, and also a lot of insights on how you've kind of grow from either a individual contributor to a leader in a startup world, as well as kind of leading this open source project, as well as maintaining it in the enterprise. How how do you think people could get started with Batfish, either the open source tool or the enterprise version?
Yeah, both are easy. For getting started with open source, I think you already showed people where the documentation is. It's basically just three simple steps that the setup page shows. Like, do Docker run. We package everything as a Docker container. You do Docker run. You initialize your snapshot, which basically means dumping all of your configs in a directory, and then you use Python to give it to battery service that is running via Docker, and then you start asking questions and do analysis.
Hmm.
That's it, and that'll give you a good sense of what batteries can or cannot do on your network. If you wanted like an enterprise experience, yeah, drop us a line. We are happy to kind of give you demo and have a chat, and also discuss, which of the two versions is works better for your organization.
Yeah, I kind of take it for granted, but just for clarification,
Mhm.
in order to use Batfish, you don't need to touch your production network, right?
That is absolutely right. I should have mentioned that. And yeah, all you need is like battery service running via Docker, and all your configs file in the directory. A lot of our users who get trying things out, just basically copy directory out of Rancid or your other
Yeah.
configuration archival tools, and that's it. You don't need access to the running network. All you need is like configs in there.
Yeah, so Batfish actually builds the model and does its own
Mhm,
analysis, all the math stuff
mhm,
within the
mhm,
tool itself from static config file, which is great, right? You kind of
mhm,
derive state from that as opposed to having to actually look at the routing table or looking at
mhm.
the
Right.
TCAM, for example.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
That's pretty awesome. So and so we'd go over how could people get started with Batfish, and what would your recommendation be with people just getting started with network validation testing?
Ah, well, that's a tough one in the following sense. I know like different people learn differently, but
Yeah,
I can share kind of what works for me. I think if I'm trying to
sure.
learn a new technology, I figure out a simple use case and try to build it. And that's what I kind of would recommend. Figure out in the context of your work and your job. Just think a use case. You're gonna basically, let's say, do figure out all undefined references, figure out
Yeah.
all shadowed ACL rules, like, do something real. So you're not just reading documentation for 2 hours, and just get started on trying to do that. It'll probably like a day long project or something. That's what you should kind of think about that. The other is ask for help. I think most open source communities succeed by being helpful, and I believe ours is as well. So I think you can join a Slack channel or ask questions on GitHub or Slack, and we are kind of here to help. That's what kind of I would recommend. So pick a project that scope to a day or two. Try to execute on that vision, and if you get stuck, ask questions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, I think I got started with just the echo analysis, which is
Yeah.
very real. I mean, the example I
Mhm,
gave before was actually a real
mhm,
problem that I
mhm.
face at work, which was just this
Mhm.
long echo
Yeah.
line, which was
Yeah.
petitioned, and
Hmm.
multiple ownership of that line, so multiple hands in that pot. And you're just really trying to
Yeah,
figure
yeah,
it out.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I would, personal experience was, started with Acco, but of course, you pick whatever problem you have in your domain, and that's definitely more fun than, like you said, reading documentation for 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
Rachel, it's definitely been a pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation. It's been a while, so it's finally good to talk to you again. Where can people find you on social? Where can people connect with you besides the Slack channel, or maybe Slack is the best way to do?
I think if you for Batfish help, Slack is probably the best. So you get interactive help. But if you want to get, I'm easy to find too. I think if you just search by my name, my Twitter handle is Ratulam, and I'm easy to find at ratulam.org as well. The email's online. I think Gmail does a good enough job at spam filtering that I feel okay having having my email up there in public. And yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
and,
No, I
and yeah,
think
if
I
you have
think
questions there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could attest to, you and the rest of the Batfish team or Intentionet team is very responsive on Slack. Whenever I post a question, I saw people posting questions, always responded right away, as so as to follow your release notes or ask questions. So as I think Slack to me is like probably the best way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, if you have Slack, that's relatively low friction, and we have a channel on network to code Slack as well. If you don't want to, do another workspace, either works for us. We monitor both of those.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah,
Hey, Ratul, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time and really appreciate you being on the show and educate us about network validation, open source project, and your own path. It's been a pleasure.
yeah. Thank you for doing this. I think I've enjoyed some of your past episodes and learned from it. So I'm glad we could chat.
Thank you. Oh, have a good day. Bye
Yeah.
bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Network Automation Nerds podcast. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other major podcast platforms. Until next time, bye bye.